Good morning, everyone. The Finance and Investment Cell of Shri Ram College of Commerce welcomes you today to today's session of Shri Ram Financial Forum. We are honored to have amongst us our guest of honor, Mr. David Rasquinha, sir. Welcome. Mr. David joined the Exim Bank in 1984 to 85, and since then had a wide-ranging exposure to the broad field of export credit, having worked in the areas of Treasury, Multilateral Agency Funded Projects, Planning and Research, Risk Management, Trade Finance, Project Finance, and Project Exports. He has served as a member on several working groups set up by the Reserve Bank of India for working capital finance to software units, facilitation measures for exporters, etc. From 1999 to 2004, he has served as the resident representative at the bank's Washington, D.C. Representative Office. In 2014, he was appointed on the board of the Exim Bank as the Deputy Managing Director and moved up as the Managing Director in 2017. He is the member of the National Jury for the CII Exim Award for Business Excellence, a total quality management award based on the TQM model of the European Foundation for Quality Management. He has also been a director on the board of 4 Indian companies. Sir has achieved so much that the list of accolades never ends. I'd like to now invite the faculty advisor of FIC, Ms. Saroj Joshi, to welcome everyone.
Good morning all. I, Saroj Joshi, on behalf of Finance and Investment Cell, SRCC, welcome you all to the session on the topic India's rightful place in the next decade. And it is giving me immense pleasure to have Mr. David Rasquinha, CEO and MD of Exim Bank of India amongst us. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out your precious time for SRCC. I welcome you. And now I request you to kindly take over the session and enlighten us with your thoughts. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ms. Joshi, and thank you, Vidya, for that very kind and gracious introduction. Students and members of the faculty, I wish I could be there with you in person and actually interact in person. Unfortunately, the present timings don't allow that. One of the great pleasures of my job is to interact with youngsters, especially students, because you are not bound by the baggage of the past. And quite often we get better ideas from interacting with you. So I'm very happy to be with you all here today. It's a great use of time, and I hope that in the course of today's interaction, both you and I can come up with some new ideas on how we can take our country forward. It's a pleasure particularly to be here with the Shri Ram Financial Forum. I see you've had some very eminent speakers in the past, and I'm honored that you invited me to join them. In the course of the next maybe half an hour, because I would like to keep as much time for Q&A as possible, I'd like to talk about what is India's rightful place in the next decade. Now, we'll keep next decade as flexible. It's not necessarily 10 years. We'll talk about it as a future. But because it is something futuristic, we need to have a plan of action. Where are we today? How did we get here? And how are we going to reach this rightful place in the next decade? What is this rightful place? How do we define it, and where do we get from here? So given that we are in the COVID times, it's a bit like a doctor's diagnostic program. If you go to a doctor today or any time, he or she is going to ask you, what is the matter? Is it a headache? Is it your throat? Is it your stomach? Where have you been in the last few days? What have you eaten? Who all have you mixed with, and so on. And based on that, he or she will come to a diagnosis and then a prescription. Let's do that again today. So I'm going to ask you to go back in time, a very, very long way back in time, so that we understand where was India in the past, where is it today, and where we would like it to be in the future. So I'm going to spend some time on the evolution itself of the Indian economy. Now, don't get confused by this chart. Just put your mind back to where we were. If you look at prehistoric times, I'm talking of before the Common Era, the Indus Valley civilization. We all know Mohenjo-daro, we know Harappa, we know Lothal, we know all these places. But these were part of the trade map. The famed Silk Roads, which went from Asia to Europe, trade was very much a part of the Indus Valley civilization. You had trade links with the Mesopotamian civilization on the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. So right from the beginning of recorded history, we were part of the trade map. We don't have statistics. Nobody was keeping statistics in those days, or if they were, they didn't survive. If you come to closer to our present time, in about 300 BC, this was the Mauryan Empire. And the Mauryan Empire, if you go back in history, was perhaps one of the biggest shining periods of India. Under Chandragupta Maurya, the Mauryan Empire encompassed the entire modern India, with the exception of the southern states, Karnataka, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and part of southern Andhra Pradesh. It encompassed all of modern day Bangladesh, parts of Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, right up to parts of Central Asia. So it was a gigantic empire even for those days. And at this time, and this was when the Mauryan Empire, the capital was Pataliputra, or current day Patna in Bihar. Now, Pataliputra was one of the greatest cities of those times. You've heard of the university at Taxashila, but did you know that it was Chandragupta Maurya who built the Grand Trunk Road, which went right from Pataliputra in eastern India to Lahore in what is current day Pakistan, or in those days Western India? Now, it sounds very simple, a road, big deal. But imagine a road of this length in 300 BCE, a phenomenal achievement. Later on, it was built on by Sher Shah Suri and others, but it was Chandragupta Maurya who first built it up at that point of time. The Maurya dynasty went on to Ashoka, but it also saw Kautilya's Arthashastra, and Arthashastra is nothing but an economic text, perhaps one of the first economic texts of those days, and of course the Ashoka pillar, which we see even today. Coming to the current era, the common era which we have today, if you look from the 1st to the 18th century, and now this is where I'll ask you to look at the chart, because obviously before the common era, there's little or no statistics. You'll see something very interesting if you look at the chart on the right-hand side. If you look at the green bar, which is in the present situation, the big green bar, not the small one, which is UK, you'll see India at the start of the millennium had accounted for something like 32% of world GDP. 32%, almost 1/3. China at that time was barely one-fourth at 25%. So just imagine a situation where India was accounting for almost 1/3 of global GDP. Now, if you follow the progress of that green bar, it reduces a bit, 28%, 24%, 22, 24, but it is still a very significant component of world GDP, more than a quarter, right? What changes? The change happens around the 1800s. Now, if you look at what was happening in Indian history, the Maurya Empire, of course, ended sometime after Ashoka. You had a whole lot of smaller kingdoms. The biggest of all was the Mughal Empire, which exceeded in size even the Mauryan Empire. With the decline of the Mughal Empire, you had the Maratha Empire from southern India growing. You had the Vijayanagar kingdom, and so on. Now, what is common to all of these, be it the Mauryas, the Mughals, the Marathas, the Vijayanagar, they were all Indians. They grew up in India, they were born in India, they lived in India, they ruled in India, they died in India. But in 1600, you had a new kind of colonizer coming in, and this was the British colonialists. Now, the British were different because they were not born in India, they didn't grow up in India, they worked for some time in India, and their only focus was to take wealth out of India back to Britain. So suddenly you had a change in the economy, and you can see how the green bar starts to shrink after the 1800s. Now, the important dates here, of course, are 1757, you had the Battle of Plassey, where Robert Clive defeated Siraj-ud-Dawla due to the treachery of Mir Jafar. But what happened really in 1757 was not just a military battle. It was the East India Company coming into India, taking over economic governance. Now, till then, kings in India levied taxes, but spent that tax money in India, be it the Mughals, be it the Marathas, be it whoever, because they were part of India. The British, for the first time, started to tax and take the money out of India to Britain. This was the critical change. Now, you can see what happened, and you can see China parallels almost the same thing. As the Indian GDP as a share starts to reduce, you see the UK start to increase. What you were seeing was a gigantic transfer of funds from India to the United Kingdom, or Britain as it was there. Now, transfer of funds, I'm being polite. It was theft. It was nothing more than theft of Indian wealth, which went into Britain. So let me give you some idea, because we talk a lot about modern Indian history. We need to understand what happened under colonialism and why we ended up in this state of affairs. After Plassey, and since the East India Company started in Calcutta, let's look at Bengal. You had the Bengal famine of 1873. Now, I'm sorry, of 1773. This was soon after the Battle of Plassey. Now, Bengal had never seen a famine until that time. India had never seen a famine. What happened? You had rapacious tax revenues being levied, food crops being confiscated, Indian industry being destroyed to enrich Britain. And you had, for the first time, a famine in India. You had a second famine in Bengal in 1873. Now, this famine was better. Why? Because after the First War of Independence in 1857, you had the British treating India with greater care. But if you look at historical records, the British government in Britain, in London, actually commanded the government in India at that point in time, saying that they should not be taking so much care of India, they should be more focused on Britain. And ultimately, it was the two world wars which devastated India. World War I from 1914 to 1918, World War II from 1939 to 1945. Now remember, these are wars which had nothing to do with India. World War I was caused by the assassination of a Serbian Grand Duke in Austria or an Austrian Grand Duke in Serbia. I don't know and I don't care. It had nothing to do with India. World War II was when the European powers were dividing up the colonial world. The invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany inspired Britain and France to also declare war, and so on. What did that have to do with India? Nothing. But Indian soldiers, Indian treasure, Indian food, all was shipped to Europe to sustain the war effort. If I can go to Sarojini Naidu, the Nightingale of India, one of our most famous poets. She wrote a poem at this point of time, and she was referring to the First World War. But if you will grant me some license, I'm going to apply that to both the First and Second World War. This is a poem called The Gift of India, and I would very much recommend you all to read this poem. I'm just quoting one stanza from this. And she is now, Sarojini Naidu is addressing Britain and the Western powers. And she says, when the terror and tumult of hate shall cease, and life be refashioned upon anvils of peace, and your love shall offer memorial thanks to the comrades who fought in the dauntless ranks. As you honor the deeds of the deathless ones, remember the blood of my martyred sons. Because it was the Indian effort which enabled the Allies to win the World War. So, but were they listening to Sarojini Naidu? No, I'm afraid not. One of the most terrible famines occurred in 1943 in Bengal, when more than 20 million people died. 20 million people. That's a horrible number. Excuse me. Why did they die? It's not that there was a shortage of food grains in India. Food grains and rice were shipped out of India to Britain for the British population, for the British armies, for the European war effort. So India was starved in order to feed the British armies. Now, this is some of the reasons why we still consider Winston Churchill. He may be a hero in Britain. In India, we should consider him a war criminal, because at his door lie these deaths. Now, this may be a little bit hard to understand, but do read history and you'll understand what happened. But the deaths were just one part of it. Indian industry was devastated. India was left poverty-stricken after the world wars, and this damaged the economy tremendously. If you take a look at the next chart, now I'm not going to spend more time on the British. We'll spend, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer it. But what happened after independence? It's one thing to say that the British were terrible, the colonization regime hurt us, but what did we do after that? India, remember, when we achieved independence, was exhausted and poverty-stricken. Our wealth had been taken away, our energies had been sapped, our soldiers had been taken away to fight a war we had nothing to do with, and we faced huge struggles. We had a new government, people who had never run a government before, who had to learn how to manage a vast new country in the context of partition and all the troubles that were there. So what happened there? Our industry had already been devastated. We were a net food exporter. We were importing food at that point of time. Now we slowly started to grow. We started with the Green Revolution to bring in high technologies and get to be self-sufficient in agriculture, in food, to the point where we are exporting food. We set up an industrialization program. Now, today, we often criticize the public sector that it is huge, it is inefficient, why did it come up? But there was a reason. In the 1950s and 1960s, when I suspect most of you were not born, in fact, I don't suspect, I know most of you were not born, and perhaps your parents were just being born at that point of time. At that point of time, there was no capital in India. India was capital scarce. The private sector didn't have the capital to invest. So the government had to invest capital and build up the public sector in steel, in heavy engineering, in heavy electricals, in defense, and so on. The problem is we went too far. From giving the public sector a leading role, at one point of time, we gave the public sector the entire role, and that was the mistake that we made. So the result is we went into the infamous license permit Raj, which damaged us hugely till we liberalized in the 1990s. Now, today, we are the world's fifth largest economy. If we look at nominal GDP, which does not account for purchasing power parity, we are the third largest economy if we look at purchasing power parity. So we've come a long way. But how far have we come? And what more do we need to do in order to go further? Now, first of all, is GDP an ideal measure? We say India's rightful place. Do we measure India's rightful place as GDP? Well, in that case, I can say we're already the third largest in terms of PPP. We may soon be the fourth largest. So maybe we can say we've already arrived. We don't have anything else to do. But GDP is not a perfect measure. After all, GDP includes the incomes that all your parents, your faculty, my salary which I get. It includes the salary that our drivers get, our maidservants get. It also includes the wealth of Mr. Mukesh Ambani, Mr. Ratan Tata, and many others. So when you do that, the average goes up. It's like saying that, look, the river is just 5 feet deep on an average. Yes, but parts of that river are probably 50 feet deep and one part is just 1 foot deep. So that average tells you nothing. So if you see the right-hand chart, you see that India is their third largest, yet we have the largest number of poverty-stricken people in the world. So clearly GDP is not the measure that we're looking at. If you look at the right-hand side, per capita GDP, yes, we're way down, but as I said, the actual position is even worse because it includes the wealth of people like Mr. Ambani and others, which biases the average upwards. So even that is not a good measure. The ideal measure would be median household income. But unfortunately, getting that number is extremely difficult to collect this information. So for the moment, let's focus on per capita income as not an ideal measure, but as an approximation that will demonstrate the proposition that we're looking at. Now, where do we go from here? If we have to boost per capita income in India, it needs a role for growing in the economy. Here's where we come with the first problem and the first challenge. Take a look at some of the tables which were shown over here. This is the fiscal deficit of the central government showing from the past 3 to 4 years. Don't get too hung up by the numbers. We have a deficit of 3.5%. This year, it's going to be way more than that because of the COVID and other situations. That's not really the issue. The issue is how are we using this deficit? Now, if you take an analogy, take the analogy of each of our households, right? We earn certain income, our parents' salaries or other investment income, and we have certain expenditure. We need food, we need power, we need Wi-Fi, very much important for today's generation. We need water, we need entertainment, we need clothes. There are various expenditures. We also need to expend on education, the fees that your parents pay for your education. Now, technically that is consumption expenditure, but I would argue that's an investment in your future. And your parents would also be investing in bank deposits, in debentures, in shares, and so on. So you have investment expenditure and consumption expenditure. Now, as long as we are looking at this, let's see what is the component. If you see, we've broken up the fiscal deficit into the revenue deficit and the rest. Now, the worrying part here is if you see the revenue deficit is more than 2/3 of the fiscal deficit. What does that mean? That means I'm borrowing, or I means the central government here is borrowing money in order to fund its ongoing consumption expenditure. Now, this is trouble. If you take the analogy of our own households, if we are borrowing money to buy a new house or even to buy a car or something like that, we are creating a capital asset, which over time will generate returns, which will enable us to pay off the loan. But if we are borrowing because we like to eat fine meals, wear fine clothes, and travel overseas, that's not going to give us the money to repay that loan. The same thing is happening in the central government. If the revenue deficit is so large, how are we going to repay? It means the GDP has to grow at a rate which is much more than the cost of capital if we have to bring down the deficit. And that is a challenge we face because we are not generating enough of revenue. We've given the breakup of expenditure on the right-hand side. I'll not belabor this point. I'll leave it for Q&A if you have questions later on. Take a look at where the economy is today. And this tells you some of the difficulties. Agriculture is still a significant part of our economy in terms of not so much GDP, but in terms of the population that it employs. So there is a huge potential in bringing population from agriculture to industry and services. Services have grown tremendously. Almost 55% of our GDP is in services, but that is not a great sign because manufacturing, and here actually industry which comprises manufacturing and mining, is just 31%. Now, we need to understand that while services are good, it is manufacturing which generates jobs, which generates your maximum value added, which creates employment, which is sustainable and growth. So this is a worry for us. That red quadrant, which is at 31, we need to build it up very, very significantly if we are to move to what we call our rightful place in the next decade. Take a look at agriculture and you see the challenge we face. I mentioned to you that while this employs the maximum number of people, its contribution to GDP is the least. Now that is just numbers. The real issue here is, are we looking at agriculture efficiently? Right? And I fear, I think there's some disturbance coming on. Could I request you to please put your mics on mute? Thank you. Are we using agriculture effectively? And the answer is no. If you take a look at the lower left-hand side, I've identified some of the problems. Now, I'm saying here that India is the third largest exporter of water, groundwater. Am I talking nonsense? Not really. If you look at it, 42% of our land area is not rain-fed, it's not irrigated, it faces drought, right? Now, if you look at Punjab and Haryana, close by to where you are in Delhi, this is the area which is drought resilient. But what are they growing? Punjab and Haryana are our largest rice producers. Why? Nobody in Punjab or Haryana eats rice unless you're eating Rajma Chawal, which is a great favorite throughout North India. But the cereal of choice in North India is wheat. It's in South and East India that rice is the cereal of choice. So why is Punjab and Haryana growing rice? Rice requires a tremendous amount of water. 1 kg of rice requires 2,800 liters of water to produce. The reason is power is free, the water table is high. Without a cost of power, the farmer can draw water, lay to flood irrigation, and grow rice. What is the price we are paying? The water table in Punjab and Haryana is dropping. It takes more power each year to draw up that water. You need deeper and deeper bore wells. And ultimately, when you're exporting basmati rice, what are we doing? We are exporting water. And we can't afford to export water because we don't have water to export. You can see that 21 cities are scheduled to run out of groundwater by 2030. And we are exporting water. The same thing with sugarcane. Sugarcane is grown in Uttar Pradesh, in Maharashtra, in Karnataka. 1 kg of sugar, right, requires 1,800 liters of water. And what are we doing? We are growing so much of sugarcane, making so much of sugar that we are exporting. A water-scarce country is exporting sugar. It makes zero sense. We need to put, and you can see the green solutions at the bottom, we need to be encouraging more of wheat growing in the north and rice in the south. We need to be encouraging growth of pulses, which take less of water, but we need to meet the protein requirement of vegetarian Indians. We need to have much greater focus on millets and so on. So we're there on agriculture, but we need to take these decisions. Drip irrigation. We need a greater farm to fork. We need modern retail. So there's a lot of work which needs to be done in agriculture if we are to reach that rightful place in the next decade. Not only agriculture, exports, and as Exim Bank, this is something which particularly concerns me. You've seen on the left-hand side, we've shown the breakup of our export basket. The pinkish highlight, I hope you're seeing it as pink, or like all men, I'm very color challenged. So it appears to me to be roughly pink. If it's a different color, please pardon me, but you can see the shading. Now, what is that shading? The shading denotes those of our exports which are predominantly commodity exports. Now, of course, you'll tell me that petroleum products is a high-tech product and not a commodity product. Yes, but it is a commodity when it comes to sale. Prices are determined off the commodity markets. So you can see the bulk of our exports are commodity. Now, below that, you can see those which are non-commodity, and you see that they're not that much. In fact, if I ask you to come down to the table in the lower left-hand side, take a look at India's share, and that tells you the problem. Overall, as a percentage of total world exports, we were at 1.8% in 2017, and the figure hasn't changed much after that. But if you look at high-tech, our share was just 0.7%, very low. Our share is biggest in low-tech. That tells you the problem right there. We have to change our export basket from low-tech to high-tech, from commodity to non-commodity, and for that, we need to invest more in R&D. Our expenditure on R&D, take a look at the figure at the text in the top right-hand side. Our expenditure on R&D is just 0.6% of GDP. I don't know if you can see a faint dot between the 0 and 6. It's not 6, it's 0.6. The screen is a little bit misleading, right? If we are spending just 0.6% of our GDP on R&D, how are we ever going to build it up? Even when you look at our high-tech exports, the India section in the middle, the bulk of it is medicaments, that's pharmaceuticals. Our pharma industry is renowned all over the world. But when you look at the relative share, you find that we are relatively tiny, and being there in pharmaceuticals is not enough. Our share, China was the largest high-tech exporter in the world, number 1. We were number 23. How are we going to grow if we don't increase our high-tech? We need expenditure on R&D, not just in pharma, but in other areas. And we need policies to attract global investment, which will enable us to grow in these areas. Moving to services. Now, I told you that services is the major part of our economy in terms of our GDP. 55% of our gross value added was services, right? Now, what many people don't realize is that we are also one of the big services exporters in the world. To give you an example, I just told you that we have a 1.8% share in global merchandise exports. And when you see the headlines in the Economic Times or the Business Standard or whichever financial newspaper you like to read, it always says India's trade deficit. What are they referring to? That is the merchandise trade deficit, the exports and imports of goods, which is perennially at a deficit in India. But if you see services, we are persistently at a surplus for the last several years. In fact, we have 1.8% of global merchandise exports, but 3.5% of global services exports. We are twice as competitive in services as we are in manufacturing. Let's not forget that. That's a very important thing. At the end of the day, why do we export, right? I mean, after all, there is nothing intrinsically good about exports and bad about imports. We export because we need foreign exchange to pay for our imports. That's it. One simple sentence. Now, whether you get foreign exchange by exporting a car or a jacket or a tie or a computer, or whether you get it by exporting computer software or business process outsourcing, it's the same dollar or pound or euro. It doesn't matter. So we need to focus on the competitive advantage we have in services and build it up. We have IT in the tier 1 cities. We need them to move to tier 2 cities, to satellite cities. We need to get more into telemedicine. We need to get more into export of our medical capabilities. We need to attract more tourists from around the world. The culture and history we have in India is unparalleled around the world. You know, it always depresses me when I go to London. The first thing, of course, is I see the fine infrastructure in London. And I remember that, hey, you guys, you stole money from us in India to pay for all this infrastructure. But more importantly, I see crowds of people standing outside, Buckingham Palace or Windsor Palace or whatever that palace is where the king and queen or whoever stay. Have you seen that palace? Take a look at the pictures. You compare it with the smallest of our Havelis in Rajasthan or elsewhere, and that palace in London looks like a small little apartment building. Yet people are going there to see that changing of the guard and some chap in a strange hat and blowing a trumpet marching up and down. We should be getting those tourists here in India. So we need to promote tourism very much, and I'll come back to this point as we go forward. Reviving investment. I spoke about how we need investment in R&D. Not only R&D, we need investment also in manufacturing. Capital formation in India has slowed down tremendously. Capacity utilization is very low. We need to have money coming into industry. If you take a look at the chart on the top left-hand side, it gives you the trend of new projects, both in the public sector as well as the private sector, and this overall surge in new projects. Now, the numbers are tiny. We need to build up this number. It's not enough to be growing at 1% and 2%. You need much more of capital investment. And if you see on the right-hand side, where has the investment been happening? It's primarily been happening in services, and the big one is e-commerce. Now, e-commerce is good. I'm not knocking it. I'm a great fan of Amazon. My wife and I we compete with each other as to who orders more things on Amazon, but that is not generating jobs as much as investment in manufacturing. We need investment in manufacturing of engineering, in textiles, in pharmaceuticals, in solar cells, and so on. So this is something which is very, very important we need as we go forward. Investment, right? Now, we often talk about trade deficit and current account deficit. Now, I talked to you about how the services account is in surplus, but the overall current account is in deficit. Is that bad? No, we want it to be in deficit. We are a developing country. Yeah, I'm sure your economics professors will have told you that your current account deficit is nothing but the savings investment gap. It's an accounting identity. If you work out the mathematics, you'll find it. So given that we are capital scarce, investment in India is greater than savings, right? You need capital from overseas. That is how every country in the world has grown. So nothing wrong with it. So we should be welcoming foreign direct investment, foreign institutional investment. We should be making this a country attractive for them to invest. Are we doing that? Not enough. Now we are talking about diverting or tempting investment away from China to India. Yes, that's a possibility, but it is not going to happen if we just sit back and wait saying India's this great opportunity. We have to go out and get people to take advantage of that opportunity, which means we need a climate which is friendly to investment, stable in policies on taxation, enabling people to acquire land and setting up plug and play facilities, what the Prime Minister referred to in his Atmanirbhar concept. We have to make this an attractive country for foreign investors, and there is a lot of work that we need to do on this. Coming to PSUs, I told you when we started why the government went into public sector in the 1950s and 1960s. There was no alternative. Today, there is an alternative. You have plenty of capital available. The private sector can do that. So if you see, we've been looking at disinvestment, and the Honorable Prime Minister and the Honorable Finance Minister both announced that non-strategic PSUs will be divested. What do we mean by non-strategic? They haven't defined it, but if you see the table on the lower right-hand side, that looks at the loss. But more important, let me call your attention, right? At the very bottom, hotel and tourist services, contract and construction and technical consultancy services. Why do we need the public sector to run a hotel or a tourist service? The private sector is there to do it. Let's get that capital out of these and put it to more efficient uses. Similarly, we don't need the public sector in transport and logistics. You don't need them in telecom and information. The private sector is way ahead. So there are a lot of low-hanging fruits where we can monetize the public sector and shift those funds to areas which are more investment needed. Special economic zones. This has been a growth area in many countries. If you look at China, China back in the 1980s started with just two SEZs in Guangzhou and Shenzhen. And from those two SEZs, which were located close to Hong Kong, have grown the economic miracle, the manufacturing giant, which is China today. We need to use these concept of SEZs. The idea has been around. Exim Bank wrote a paper on this back in the 1990s. But unfortunately, SEZs in India have become more of a land grab. Much of the land is lying unutilized, and our policies have been unfriendly. Our taxation policy was changed some time ago. I think it was in the early 2000s, to make the MAT, the minimum alternate tax, applicable to SEZs, which changed the whole economics of the whole SEZs. So this is another low-hanging fruit we need to encourage for us to grow further as we go forward. Flexible labor laws, right? Now, We are not trying to suggest that you remove all the labor law and let the workers be on their own. No. But we are harassing industry with the amount of labor laws. If you look at it, labor is on the concurrent list. The center and the state governments can both make laws. And as on date, the second bullet, there are more than 40 central laws and more than 100 state laws governing labor law. You need to have a huge department in any factory just to make sure you're complying with all the laws. And some of those laws are way outdated. You have, for example, a boiler inspector. Now you'll find that this boiler inspector will come and visit not just in heavy industry or textiles where you do need a boiler. He will also come to an IT company and say, look, I have to inspect your boiler. Now, what use does an IT company have for a boiler? A boiler generates steam, which is used to run machinery. But he will come there and he will make a nuisance of himself until he's paid off or asked to go away, right? So we need to rationalize labor law. We don't need to throw it all away, but we need to rationalize it, simplify compliance, and make it a more attractive version, both for labor as well as for the employers. Global value chains. Now, we know, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the latest model mobile phone, whether you prefer, I don't know, Apple or Android or whatever. My daughter tells me a lot of things, most of which I don't understand, but I'm sure you are all experts in the use of these phones. You're all aware that the iPhone and the iPad, though it is made in China, is the final assembly. You have subcomponents coming from various parts. Now, if you look at the value added, the biggest value added, which is in the technical design and the patents, is from Apple in the USA. The rest is mere aggregation. But as part of that value chain, China has that control. We don't. If you look at the charts on the right-hand side, if you see the green line, which is India, when we look at forward linkages, that is how much of Indian content is there in a foreign export. Very low. You look at the chart on the lower right-hand side, it's the opposite. How much of foreign content is there in India's exports? Very high. Now we need to have that green line in the top right-hand chart move up and the green line in the bottom right-hand chart move down. So we have to be a part of global value chains. We have to be reliable suppliers. We have to attract India overseas investment to be part of these chains and be a part of these global value chains. Many are looking at alternatives to China. We have to be there for that. DFIs. This is a pet peeve of mine. We set up the development financial institutions in the 1960s and 70s, the IDBI, the ICICI, the IFCI. I don't know if these acronyms are even familiar to your generation, but these were the term lending institutions which provided long dated money to enable industry to grow and develop. Because of them, you have the house of Tatas, the house of Birlas, the Ambanis, and all the industrialists who are today big names in India got their start with the DFIs. If the DFIs had not been there, they would not have been there because the DFIs were the mediator between collecting capital from the savings and the government and channelizing it into industry. For reasons which have never been clear, we closed down the DFIs in the 90s, and you can see the effect on the NPAs today. Interestingly, and this is a personal anecdote I can share with you, in 1994, a team from China came and visited us at Exim Bank. I was a very junior officer at that point in time, but I was called into the boardroom and asked to make a presentation on Exim Bank. Now, you can imagine I was extremely nervous because my CEO was there. There was a vice minister from China. There was the governor of the People's Bank of China. There were all these dignitaries, and I was supposed to talk about Exim Bank. You know why they were there? They listened to the entire presentation on Exim Bank, what we were doing, etc. They visited IDBI, they visited all these. They went back to China, and then they set up the Exim Bank of China, the China Development Bank, the Agricultural Bank of China, the China Construction Bank, and so on. They took our experience and created those institutions. Today, those institutions are gigantic. And what have we done in India? We've closed down some of these institutions. We need to once again open up the DFIs and give them the role that they once had in the economy. Now, I have some charts on COVID, on the impact, which I don't plan to go through unless you have questions, because much of it is estimates. I've completed almost, I think, 40 minutes out of the 1 hour. So what my preference would be, unless you want me to talk about this COVID, which very frankly, I don't want to, I would rather take questions from you and answer questions that you may have. So Vidya or whoever else is moderating, can I maybe take a break at this point of time and invite questions from the audience? I'd rather take questions than keep talking, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, definitely. We have a set of questions that we received when we sent out the registration forms.
Mm-hmm.
So we compiled and we've collected a few questions from there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go ahead and ask those right now.
Sure.
Given that 14% of India's imports are from China, and at least 16 unicorns have a minimum of one Chinese investor, it is close to impossible to boycott the country completely due to recent trends that have developed. And how much does individual effort of not using Chinese goods decrease this independence? And as the world is shifting to a more anti-globalization phase with people becoming a little skeptical about the foreign-made products, how is the export and import likely to be affected?
Okay. My compliments to whoever asked that question. It's brilliant. Let me split it into two parts. First, let me deal with China, and then I'll come to the general multilateral. On China, absolutely right, whoever asked that question. You're seeing a lot of tamasha on WhatsApp and the news channels, etc. People supposedly burning some Chinese product or dropping a TV from their balcony. This is plain stupidity. All you're doing is damaging yourself, right? Let's understand. Yes, we should become more self-reliant. We should become more Atmanirbhar, as the Prime Minister said. We should be doing all these things. But this is not an electric switch that you put up or down or a tap that you turn off, on or off. This is a process. If today you decide that, yes, I want to reduce my imports from China, it's going to be 3 years before you can give effect to that. Because after all, let's say you're importing this particular gadget from China. Let's say an API for a pharmaceutical drug, right? You're importing this from China. Now, why are you importing it? Because obviously nobody is making it in India, or the cost of making it in India or in another country is higher than that. So if you just today stop, no more China, either you don't have the raw material or you're paying a premium for that raw material. You need to then increase the price of your sale of goods. You need to renegotiate your export contracts. You need to do a whole lot of changes. It's not possible. Business doesn't work that way. What you need to do is start developing capacity in India. If you're importing a particular API from China, talk with Indian manufacturers, find somebody who's willing to invest to make that API, give him or her a guaranteed offtake contract for the next 10 years, set that in place so that he or she can set up the production, manufacture the API, get the quality tests done, supply it to you, you get approval from the US Fed and Drug Administration. All that is going to take 3 to 5 years. Dropping TVs is not going to help it. So whoever asked that question, yes, let's make a start. By all means, we should not be dependent on China. We should be self-reliant, but let's not fool ourselves that it happens overnight. It's a process and we need to work on it. Second question on the breakdown of multilateralisms. Yes, this is a huge worry. If those of you who are students of economics or those of you who like economics, if you go right back to the days of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, there has been an economic consensus on the benefits of free trade, right? Yes, anytime you have free trade, you have some losers and you have some winners, but the number of winners always exceeds. Comparative advantage has never been disproved. However, ever since the last few years, partly thanks to President Trump's economic illiteracy, partly thanks to China's unfair use of techniques in global trade, the consensus on multilateralism is breaking down. The consensus on free trade is breaking down. This is a big worry for us because, the WTO disproportionately benefits developing countries like India because it's a one country, one vote. Otherwise, believe me, the developed countries like the USA, China, UK, Germany would steamroller us. So this is a very, very big worry for us. I think it is necessary. We don't know what's going to happen with the US elections in November, but it is necessary for us to work with like-minded countries to restore that multilateral system of trade. All of us would benefit from it. And in parallel, we must join to ensure that China does not take advantage of the multilateral system like it has been doing all these years. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, sir, definitely. So another question on the same lines of China's influence. China's influence in the African continent has been growing over the past many years, and the debt trap policy of China has led to fear of political and geographical hegemony. So, how can the investment schemes of India counter this ever-growing influence in our own neighborhood?
Again, brilliant question. If you compare the two in terms of quantum, there's no comparison. Because I know it because we at Exim Bank run India's bilateral assistance to the African countries. So we are much, much smaller than China. But I will assure you from personal experience, and I've traveled throughout the African continent, visited most of the countries there, met with governments, visited projects, actually gone through villages in Africa to see how things are. If you give the choice between a project from India and a project from China, in almost every case, you will find that they will ask you that they prefer India. Why is that so? First of all, there are no hidden costs when it comes to India. We run a clear, transparent procurement process which ensures that there is price discovery and the country gets the best possible deal that it will get. Secondly, we do not take any lien. For example, to give you an example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo or Zimbabwe, in return for its debt, China has basically taken a charge on the diamond mines, the platinum mines, the cobalt mines in these countries, right? So it's very clear that what is happening is a resource grab. You're giving an ostensibly cheap loan, but what you're actually doing here is taking those resources. India does nothing of the sort. The third reason, when you have a Chinese project, it's done by Chinese laborers, Chinese designers. You have Chinese cooks going there to the project. Some of this is supposed to be prison labor. We don't know. That's just a rumor. And many of those Chinese then remain in those countries afterwards. There are countries where a significant part of their retail chains now are run by Chinese. India does not do that. We take pains to create the infrastructure, to create schools, medical facilities for people, and Indians do not stay back there and try to take over that country. So I can assure you that definitely those countries need money, but if they have the choice, they will always ask for an Indian facility.
Okay, so the next question. So recently our Forex reserves have reached an all-time high, crossing the milestone of $500 billion. And for the past few weeks, the USD and INR have constantly been fluctuating between the 75 to 67 rupee range. Could you throw light on how that has impacted the exchange rate, how the exchange rate has impacted our exports and imports? And do you think it would be beneficial for us if, for our exporters, if this exchange rate is maintained?
Good question again. See, if I can take a step back, what determines the exchange rate? Your standard response should be demand and supply. I mentioned to you, we run a trade deficit, we run a services surplus, but the current account is in deficit, right? So you have a current account deficit, which means on any trading day, because what sets the price of the rupee, it's trading in the interbank market between banks, buying and selling dollars, which sets the exchange rate. So on any given day, your demand for dollars should be greater than your supply of dollars, which means the rupee should depreciate. What actually happens is different because you can't separate the current account from the capital account. You have an inflow of money coming in from FDI. You've read in the papers about how various Facebook and various private equity are investing in Reliance Jio, right? Of course, that money hasn't come in yet, but it will come in. Or when Amazon invests or Walmart invests. Now that is dollars coming into India, being converted into rupees because you need to spend rupees in India. Similarly, other foreign investment which comes into Indian debt and equity means people are selling dollars and buying rupees. That changes the demand supply equation and keeps the rupee strong. Now, this is where the Reserve Bank intervenes because the Reserve Bank doesn't want the rupee to get too strong. A little bit of strength helps you keep inflation under control, but too strong will decimate the export industry. So the Reserve Bank steps in and buys dollars. So when the Forex reserves go up to the record 504 billion, as you rightly said, what it means is that there is more money coming into India and the Reserve Bank is soaking that up. Now, it's not an ideal situation. If you look at it, 504 billion, actually 504 is your total reserves. It also includes gold and SDRs, but let's not quibble about that. What that means is that India is investing $500 billion in the USA. Because if we are holding dollars, the dollars are invested somewhere. They are in bank deposits, they are in treasury securities, they're in corporate securities. Now, this is insane that a developing country, capital scarce like India, is investing capital in the USA. But there's a reason, because you need those forex reserves to keep the economy stable. How much do you need? That is the $1 million question. I think 500 billion is way too much. I would like to see that come down a little bit. But then at the same time, I appreciate the RBI has to run a balancing line. The second part of your question, how does it affect exports and imports? And I'm glad you asked it, because there's a lot of talk about this, that, a depreciating currency will help Indian exporters, and just by keeping the rupee weak, it will grow. No, it's not so. It's an asymmetric effect. If you talk to any exporter or a banker, they will tell you that when the rupee appreciates, the exporter takes a hammering. When the rupee depreciates, the exporter does not get that much of benefit. He gets only this much of benefit. Do you know why that happens? Because if you remember my slide on the commodity composition, in most cases, Indian exporters are price takers, not price makers. The result is, if the rupee appreciates, the overseas buyer who is buying towels or home textiles or whatever from us says, hey, that's your problem. I signed a contract for X dollars per piece. You maintain X dollars per piece. How you manage it is your problem. But when the rupee depreciates, the same gentleman is on the phone saying, hey, you've got this nice big windfall money. I want a part of that. Now, if the Indian exporter at that point says, hey, get lost, that's your problem, he's not getting more orders, right? Because those same towels can be supplied by other countries. So we have to strengthen our position, which is why I was saying we have to move into more high-tech products where we can set the price and not be at the mercy. So the short answer is it's an asymmetric effect. A rupee appreciation hurts the exporter, a depreciation helps him only a little, not very much.
Okay, so okay. The next question would be, so you mentioned, you talked about the agricultural sector. So should the government begin to divert its budget focus from agriculture to other sectors? And if yes, which sector, and how should we approach the same with regard to exports?
I would say no. We don't need to divert spending away. We need to spend it better, right? If you see, a lot of the government's expenditure is, for example, on fertilizer subsidy. Now, somebody once did a calculation, I forget who it was, which said if you add up all the fertilizer subsidy, which the government has given over the last maybe 30 to 40 years, you could have bought out the entire global fertilizer industry probably 5 times over, right? So we're spending that money unproductively. More importantly, we don't discriminate between phosphatic fertilizers, potassium fertilizers, and urea. If you look at it, there is price control for urea. The cost of urea is very low, but there is no price control on potash or phosphate. What does the farmer do? The farmer ultimately is a rational human being. He's going to buy the cheaper fertilizer which he can afford. So you have huge amounts of urea being deployed. You have greater nitrogenation of the soil, but no potash and no potassium. So you're not getting any results out of this kind of twisted or skewed spending. Similarly, you don't need the government to get into some spending if you can get the private sector in. You need modern retail. Now, the recent reforms announced by the government, the scrapping or the amendment of the Essential Commodities Act, the permission to farmers that they don't have to sell everything at the APMCs, that is huge, right? Because the farmer now has a wider choice. But there are two sides to the coin. By saying he is not forced to sell at the APMC, that begs the question, who else is he going to sell to? It's one thing to give him freedom. How is he going to use it? Now, till you allow modern retail, whether it is, in Mumbai, it's Big Bazaar and Reliance Jio. In Delhi, I'm not sure, Super Bazaar or whoever. Unless they can go to the farmer and buy directly from the farmer, it doesn't really help to make these changes. Because ultimately, what's going to work out is that the farmer is forced to make a choice. So you need modern retail, you need investment in modern retail, maybe FDI in modern retail. Excuse me. I'd like to see a lot more D-Marts and Reliance Geos and Big Bazaars and Super Bazaars and whatever name you have around the country, all over the country, because that is when the farmer gets a more remunerative price. And the government doesn't need to do anything about it. But the government, I would like to see the government spending more money on health and education. This COVID crisis has brought home to us, our spending on health is negligible. Our spending on Education is next to nothing. That is where the government should be spending its money.
Okay, so so we have another question. So several US-based tech companies like Apple are moving their supply chain out of China. So there is a possibility that they set up manufacturing units in India and a couple of other Asian countries. How do you think this would affect our exports and imports? And do you think how beneficial would it be for us?
See, this is a huge area of potential for us. It's a standard tenet of risk management that you never be over dependent on a single supplier or a single buyer. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. Yet, because China offered so many economies of scale, so much of production efficiency, many countries became very heavily dependent on China. Apple and others are just one of them. Now, after the COVID outbreak and seeing all the border problems China's having, the tussles they're having with the US, I mean, I think China is the one country which seems to have a quarrel with just about everybody in the world. Now, many companies are starting to realize that it is not safe for them to be on this single source basis. So now they're not going to shut down their operations in China. Not possible. Those have been set up with a lot of capital investment over a period of years. It's not something you just turn on. But what they will do is set up a second or a third operation in another country to hedge their risk. So what we in India should be doing is not looking at replacing China. That's impossible. But we should be looking at being that number 2 or number 3, and in due course, moving up to number 1. You can't be number 1 overnight. So that is huge potential for us. Yes, it will transform our exports and imports, but the big but, and I think I mentioned it in the course of my speech also, we can't just sit back and assume that, okay, they're moving out of China, they're reducing China, they'll automatically come to India. No, there are other countries which are also marketing. Vietnam is marketing itself, Bangladesh is marketing itself, Taiwan is marketing itself. So many countries are all fighting to be this number 2, number 3, number 4. If we just sit back and wait, nothing is going to come to us. We have to actively go out, government and industry together, meet these companies, offer them, look, okay, what is it that you are looking for? Done. We'll do that here in India. We need to have a marketing campaign ourselves. We need to have an investment drive. Then only it will work.
Okay, sir. Yeah. So India has been known to produce cheap and generic medication to the entire world. So how should India move to create a dominance in the world in medicine exports to cover the deficit?
Okay, you won't cover the deficit, but certainly we can increase our share, right? Yeah. See, when you talk of medicines, there is one very significant difference between a pharmaceutical product. I mean, whether you call it a finished dose formulation or whatever, I'm using a generic term, right? Most things, when you're buying a shirt or a textile or something, price is most important. Quality also is there, but price is a critical issue. When it comes to health products, safety is number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to number 10. Your manufacturing process, your quality control, your suppliers, your processes, your sales, your transportation, your logistics, everything has to be approved. If you ever have the chance of looking at an FDA audit by the US Food and Drugs Administration, you'll realize what an intensive process it is. It comes to a point where if there is a single fly or mosquito in a factory premises, that entire factory is derated. One, it just takes one. If you've torn up and thrown away a test result, you're derated, because even a negative test result is important and must be kept, right? So the answer for us is not to look at price competitiveness. That is a mug's game. We have to ensure that our quality of medications, our robustness of process is so strong that nobody can come. See, if you look at price competitiveness, it is always possible for somebody in another country to make the same product cheaper than you. He will get a subsidy, he will get something. But to go through that inspection process takes years to learn that. That is our real strength. So if we can focus on keeping that quality and robustness strong, we will be the world rulers.
That's great. Yeah, so another question. The government of India stated a target of $5 billion economy. how big can India's net exports, how big does India's net export play a role in achieving this particular target?
You should look at being at least around 18 to 20% of the target. See, we're a big economy. If you look at an economy like Korea, which is big, but their population is relatively small, for them, export imports are probably 60 to 75% of GDP. Now, that is because their domestic economy is small. Our domestic economy is huge. And given the size of our population, given that our GDP, barring the COVID impact, would be growing faster than world GDP. So you expect that most of our goods and services would be sold domestically. Nothing wrong in that. But at least 18 to 20% should be aimed at the export market so that we maintain our quality reputation and we get the foreign exchange to pay for it. So if you're talking 5 billion, you should be looking at least 1 billion in exports, both of goods as well as services. So if you look at goods last year, we were around 300 billion. Forget the COVID impact because that's a one-off which will come back. But typically goods and services of around, goods of around 300 billion exports, services a little under 200 billion. So we're barely halfway there. We need to double in order to reach that 1 billion.
Okay, sir. The last question we have. So various countries middle of different types of crisis currently. On humanitarian grounds, what aid is it that can be given to countries by countries who are in a better position in comparison to them?
That's more for the government of India to answer, but the government does give a lot of aid to these countries. Through Exim Bank, I know we have given through the government of India debt relief to many of these countries. First of all, even the bilateral aid that we give to them in terms of the lines of credit is highly concessional. I mean, to give it an idea, you're all students of economics and commerce. Imagine a 25-year loan with a 5-year grace period at an interest rate of 1.5%, right? I mean, your actual NPV is probably negative when you compute it over the 25-year period. So the grant element in this is already very large. Given the present COVID circumstances, definitely there is a case for debt relief. The G20 communique allowed, in fact, it's a little confusing because they say you should give debt relief, but it should be NPV neutral. Now, I mean, I've done finance for 35 years and I don't understand how NPV neutral is debt relief, but apparently the G20 has an idea about it. But the government of India has already done that. We've got requests from a number of countries. They're being processed because obviously you need a uniform approach. I mean, to be very blunt with you, you can't have a situation where India gives relief and no other country gives relief, right? Then we are the people who are being made a fool of. So it has to be a global initiative and the government of India is already acting on it.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. So as the session draws to an end, I, on behalf of the Finance and Investment Cell of SRCC, would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to you, sir, who took out the time from his schedule to share his insights with us. And I would also like to thank Ms. Saroj Joshi for all her support, professors of SRCC, and all in attendance for today's session. Thank you so much for making this session so successful. I would now like to invite Ms. Saroj Joshi for a vote of thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David, sir. It was such a wonderful and insightful session. And I think in a short span of 1 hour, you have covered so many things that I think everybody has benefited a lot from this session. And maybe we can have more interactions in the future. And if the situations improve, I hope we'll have the privilege to invite you on our campus and have some interactions there also. Thank you so much, sir. It was lovely listening to you. I would also love to thank my FIC team for organizing the session and all the participants for being here with us. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, David, sir.
Thanks for all of you. I hope I didn't put you to sleep. Since I can't see you, I have no way of making sure, but I'd love to visit you someday and carry this on.
Definitely, sir, definitely.
Thank you very much.